Hello, I'm Corey Hello, and welcome to another episode of Critimation, where I review animated TV shows and films. As always, I do not own any of these films or shows. They are properties of their respected owners. So, a quick announcement before we start. Just so everyone knows, I am pretty much done with X, formerly Twitter. From now on, most of my promotional posts for this channel will be on Blue Sky. It's not as political as X. So without further ado, let's get started. So for today's video, we have a guest with us who's from the school I used to go to and volunteer, PNCA. Please welcome Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. My name's Alyssa. I'm an animation major at PNCA and a stop motion minor.
So if you haven't guessed already, based on the title of this video, Alyssa is Native American. Would you be comfortable with telling us which tribe you're from?
Sure. I mean, it's a pretty small tribe, but we are five tribes combined into one. We're called the Tulalip tribes. We're a coastal Northwest tribe.
So, because the topics that we are talking about don't necessarily deal with coastal tribes, questions that I will be asking will be mostly geared towards issues that any indigenous population would face even today. Our first topic is the Pup Named Scooby Doo episode, The Story Stick, which takes place, of all places, on an Indian reserve. Now, I've heard a lot of bad things about this concept. Would you mind explaining why that is?
An Indian reservation has many layers to it. A reservation is a place where indigenous peoples were forced to live, either with their tribes or with other tribes, all pushed into one area. They were forced to sign treaties in order to live. A lot of children were kidnapped anyways, though, from their homes in order to abuse them by wiping them from their culture and cutting their tongues out and erasing their memories under the guise of taking them to a school to educate them and like to be civilized. So being used for a setting is interesting. Like, what tribe are you trying to represent? Just being more mindful. I know that all of these shows are older.
Wow, that is a lot to consider. I actually remember recently rewatching this show called Hysteria. It's basically Saturday Night Live with the celebrities being historical figures. And there was a segment that was called Indian Giver, and it was Custard having these chiefs on a talk show, and the answer to everything was basically surrender your land and move to a reserve. So
Yeah.
yeah, looking back on stuff like that, it's like, wow, this is pretty jarring today.
It's interesting to think about where media comes from in the first place. Like, film has originated as like an illusionary magic thing to manipulate an audience. So when these shows come out and they're misrepresentations of history or just grotesque versions of lies, it is something to think about of should I be watching this and be entertained by this? So it's obviously less mindful. So it's definitely to something to think about today.
So going back to Scooby Doo, the episode begins with the gang having a camping trip to the reserve, and we see Scooby and Shaggy dressed up as stereotyped native Indians, complete with the broken English talk. And Daphne's like, "You've been watching too many movies lately. Indians are just like any other person." Considering this is an 80s show, do you have any thoughts on this scene and why Daphne's remark might have a deeper meaning?
I think it's interesting because there's definitely different layers to what it is of what being a Native American is or an Indigenous person is versus everyone else. Like, obviously, we're all Homo sapiens and we should treat each other like humans and with respect and being mindful to each other's cultures and differences. So I think it's meant well, and I think everyone should be mindful of each other.
After the gang meet one of the residents, Warren, who serves as their guide, Scooby and Shaggy are set out to gather some firewood, during which they encounter a totem pole monster, although no one believes them at first. But they are soon backed up by Warren's grandfather, who tells them about the totem pole spirits who have returned because his people's land is threatened by developers who want to build a hotel on the reserve. Seeing that they have a potential mystery on their hands, the gang begin looking for clues. Their first clue is a bead from a Native American necklace. Upon closer inspection, they found out that it's from Ryan's grandfather's necklace. They then meet Ryan, the developer who plans to build the hotel on the reserve. Before heading off, Velma sees a bunch of wood and paint in the back of his truck. Shortly after, the gang, along with Lauren, sit around the campfire to roast marshmallows. Before leaving, Warren presents them with a story stick, which they use to take turns telling the same story. So, this story stick, is that just made up, or is there some truth behind that?
I wanted to pull up the origin of the story stick because I was curious myself. Personally, in my tribe, the story stick is not a thing in the way that you would think. I would say a microphone is a story stick, right? So if we scroll down to the story, it's been adapted from Chris Lamb. The story, I'm just going to summarize it. The story of the talking stick originated from five Native American tribes: the Mohawk, Seneca, sorry if I mispronounced that, Cayuga, Oneida, and the Onondaga. These tribes all lived in what is now Upper New York State near the shores of Lake Ontario. But they were fighting terrible wars with each other, and people were suffering, and it just wasn't a good time for the indigenous peoples. So, a very great man named Degana Wida finally helped them learn to make a peace agreement among the five tribes. And he used the talking stick as a symbol of like speaking, and everyone was to respect that object so that everyone could communicate clearly and effectively, because that's what ends wars, is being able to be transparent with each other and just communicate each other's needs and try to work together.
Kind of like a microphone, like you were saying earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, they were able to bring peace within the communities. So I think that's a very
Wow.
powerful story.
Yeah. Yeah, they totally blurred the lines in this episode then. So anyway, the gang start telling each other stories about an alien invasion when the totem monster shows up. Thankfully, Scooby digs a huge hole which covers the monster up, allowing the gang to escape. The gang then decides to split up. After seeing Warren with some tribal artifacts, and a chase scene between the gang and the totem pole monster, the gang not only discover a piece of wood that fell off the monster, but also a hole filled with ancient indigenous artwork. Velma then divides a plan to capture the totem pole monster, while Scooby and Shaggy distracted with the help of the story stick. Velma uses a mail-order termite to destroy the costume of the monster. After putting the clues together, Velma deduces that the monster is really Ryan, who, having discovered the artifacts previously, decided they were worth more than just building a hotel, and came up with the totem monster disguise to scare everyone off the reserve. The episode ends with the decision to not make the hotel, but instead a permanent exhibit featuring the artifacts that were found. But I do have two last questions regarding this episode. Firstly, it's about the totem spirit. Would you say that's appropriation? Because I've never heard of anything in that kind of context before.
I would say especially yes, because let's pull up the definition of appropriation, because I feel like a lot of people don't know exactly what appropriation means in the context of cultural appropriation. This is just straight up from the internet. Cultural appropriation is the adoption of an element or an elements of one's culture or identity by members of another culture or identity in a manner perceived as inappropriate or unacknowledged. So the fact that the person in the totem was the archaeologist makes it appropriation just because they were not a Native American or an indigenous person. But that's outside from just the fact that the show is not an indigenous-led show.
Reminds me of one of my previous episodes I just did, where I do talk a little bit about some native tropes in Western themed episodes, and a couple of the segments have white characters dress up as Native Americans. I'll never look at that Western Fairly Odd Parents episode again. I mean, dances with wands? Come on.
There's a lot of interesting tropes within movie history, things like blackface or pretending to be something that you're not. So I think that's shared within many different aspects of people.
My second closing question for this is that Ryan is using not just the artifacts to make money, but he originally wanted to make a hotel on native land. Would you say this kind of stuff is still an issue with indigenous populations today?
It is. Unfortunately, today, even treaties are being broken. For example, a Texas company, they do trains all the way up to, I don't know, Alaska. I forget where they end, but they hold oil and they went through the reservation because apparently that's the only way they can get through north. And they're only allowed to do 25 barrels, I believe, per passing. And they ended up doing 100. Okay, so that's way out of their clearance, and they ended up spilling into our waters, my personal reservation's waters. And they were sued for whatever 2 million, I don't remember, like a bunch of money, but it's not going to save our waters, it's not going to save our fish, and it's not going to save the health of our peoples because money's worthless in this case. So, yeah, it's very unfortunate, but it still happens.
Even though some of the early scenes kind of mean well, I feel like this is more of a product of the time, as the appropriation from a white villain kind of makes it feel less progressive than it takes itself on to be. And I would not recommend this to anyone, Scooby Doo fan or otherwise. Our next segment is Pocahontas 2 Journey to a New World, which is the sequel to the Disney version of the character. Okay, two things before we start on this review. One, if you dislike the first movie, you're absolutely gonna hate this one. And two, there's actually two Johns in this movie, John Smith and John Rolfe. I guess John was a common name at the time. So for clarity, I will mostly refer to these two by their last name. The film opened several years after the original, and has Smith being chased by several guards trying to arrest him for supposed treason. Eventually, he is cornered by the original film's villain, Ratcliffe, who had set up the whole scheme. Stating that the king believes his side of the story, he sends Smith to a watery grave. After reporting a lie to the king, war between the natives and England seems inevitable. Thankfully, a ship bound for the New World has been set so that they can recruit the chief and discuss terms of peace between the two lands. In the New World, news of Smith's death reaches Pocahontas, and she decides to move on, burying his cuppas in the snow. Shortly after, the ship that was set by the king for peace arrives in Jamestown. And among the crew is the diplomat, Rolfe. A fight over a biscuit by Percy and Miko causes Rolfe's horse to lose control and nearly starts a conflict between the settlers and the nearby observers from Pocahontas' tribe. Thankfully, things settle down after Ralph intervenes, much to Pocahontas' dissatisfaction as she wants the settlers to know that her tribe can be trusted to do the right thing. That night, Ralph appeals before the tribe and presents the chief with a horse. Though it is a bit awkward because he mistook Pocahontas' name for his, but things work out. That is until Ralph tells the chief he is required to come back to London to discuss peace with the king. So Pocahontas volunteers to go in her father's place instead. After meeting with her old friend Grandmother Willow, Pocahontas is advised to listen to her heart, or as she puts it, listen to the spirit within. The following morning, after a tearful goodbye from her friends and family, Pocahontas boards the ship. Joining her is Ute Makamaka, or Ute for short. Now, to me at least, Ute seems like a stereotype because he's all silent, he does nothing but cross his arms and occasionally act as a bodyguard for Pocahontas. Would you agree with me on that?
I would. I guess I haven't studied the characters long enough to truly understand what he represents as an icon. What do you think he represents?
In the Western thing I mentioned earlier, he's basically that, oh, he's so serious, he has no other personality than
Yeah.
just
And I'm wondering, like, is that just a representation of how an outside group would see people who are reserved and protective towards their people? They just see a stone wall of apathy or something. I'm not sure
honest.
because he clearly cares about Pocahontas.
Yeah, but honestly, since he doesn't talk much, there's not much to go off of.
And it might just be like, we have nothing to say. We have nothing else to say to you. Like I'm just not sure. There's many things he could represent, either stereotype or just how we've had to live to protect ourselves.
After setting sail, Pocahontas discovers her animal friends as stowaways and is nearly arrested by the captain for harboring them. Thankfully, Ralph cuts in and stands up for her. This allows the two to form a understanding for each other and possibly some romantic feelings as well. Once in London, Pocahontas becomes astounded with all the sights and sounds of the city. This is cut short by the arrival of Ratcliffe, who states that the king has signed a form allowing him to set up an armada should there be a war. The group then arrive at Ralph's dwelling and are introduced to his housemaid, Mrs. Jenkins. After which, Ralph is presented before the king and explains the situation. At first, the king is unwilling to meet with Pocahontas, but then a scheming Ratcliffe suggests that they meet at the Hunt Ball. That way, she can prove that she's civilized. The king agrees and states that if he's not impressed, then the Armada sails. At first, Ralph is doubtful that this will work and considers it a trap set by Ratcliffe. But Pocahontas is willing to learn the ways of the English woman, and this includes dressing like one and acting like one. Later on, she is given a necklace and is forced to take off her own, thereby allowing herself to be molded into something that she is not.
Well, it's really interesting because it's hard to speak about it when you know who Pocahontas really was and how she was really treated. Pocahontas wasn't even the age that she was depicted in the movie. She was a child
Right.
and she was
I think a lot of
abused.
people know that.
Yeah, she was kidnapped, abused, and mistreated, and she died at the dinner table vomiting. I don't think that acting like them is civilized. And I don't think that forcing other cultures to form into yours is respectful. Obviously, I think any oppressed person or oppressed group would come to that conclusion as well. I feel like everyone should respect everyone.
Once the ball commences that night, things go well at first, until Ratcliffe reveals who the entertainment is. A bunch of jesters torturing a bear through what is known as barrel baiting. This causes Pocahontas to defend the bear and act uncivilized in front of everyone. Now, to me, this brings to mind the whole, oh, she's Native American, so she's one with nature. What are your thoughts on this?
It's interesting because there's different metaphors with this bear to me. The first one is a monster, like being represented as a monster, even though you're just a part of the earth. You're a natural part of the cycle, and you're torturing that creature to try and get it to use its tools, use its claws, use its fangs, even though it didn't want to. So that's one thing. Having like a white person prodding a strong creature that you should respect just so that you can get it to lash out. And that's entertainment. It seems really outrageous as an activity. If it is a trope, I'm not sure, but I definitely don't think anyone should be torturing strong animals.
I was just curious because I've seen the commercial with the crying native.
The
It's like,
commercial.
yeah, like, oh, the native's crying because we're destroying the land.
Mm. Well, I am. I'm crying.
All right.
I'm
All right.
crying.
Okay. I'm just saying because I've seen a lot of reaction videos which use that commercial and
I know that not all people think the same. Just like
yeah,
in any community, there's still division within your own group, right? There's
yeah.
people who still believe in capitalism. There's still people who want to be selfish and not help their community. And that's totally within their own right to be self-preservative. Like, do what you have to do. Just don't hate other groups and don't promote ignorance.
As a result of Pocahontas' behavior, she and Ute are arrested for speaking out against the king. On returning home, Ralph is approached by a mysterious figure, and the two, along with the animals, rescue Pocahontas and Ute, during which the figure is revealed to be John Smith, alive and well. After escaping prison, they hide out at a cabin in which John Smith reveals that Ratcliffe had framed him. And while he wants Pocahontas to be safe, Rolf wants to stop Ratcliffe. The two Johns argue, causing Pocahontas to run off in despair. Shortly after, Smith realizes that Rolf has romantic feelings for Pocahontas. Once Pocahontas is alone, she comes to a clearing where there's an oak tree resembling Grandmother Willow, and remembering her friend's words to not forget who she is, she wipes off the makeup and lets her hair down, thereby returning to her true identity. She then tells everyone that she's decided to return to London to try one last time. After being given back her necklace, the group approached the king, and Pocahontas makes it clear that there is no gold to be found. And while the king is still skeptical about this, Smith revealing himself to be alive is enough for the king to see that Ratcliffe had been lying from the start. The group then head out to stop Ratcliffe and the Armada, and Smith takes on Ratcliffe head on. The group are successful, and Ratcliffe is arrested for his lies. During the celebration, before Ralph and Pocahontas can admit that they love each other, Smith interrupts and proposes that Pocahontas go on adventures with him. But Pocahontas tells Smith that she'd rather return home. After the two say their goodbyes, Pocahontas boards the ship returning back home and discovers that Ralph has decided to go with her. Film ends with the two sharing a kiss as they sail off into the sunset. Now, knowing the history of the real life Pocahontas, I can say that this film is as inaccurate as the original. In real life, they do marry, though it's forced in real life rather than developed in this case.
Right.
Is
Um,
why is the trope of having a native woman fall in love with a white man so problematic?
I have a lot to say about that because there's a lot of different opinions out there based on who you are, whether or not be like you're diluting our tribal population or you're washing our culture or disrespecting in some kind of way. Like that's one thing, which is an opinion that I don't personally share. I feel like we should all be sharing our cultures, no matter who you are. Obviously, this is disturbing in the context of Pocahontas because of what actually happened. John Smith and Pocahontas were never in love. He just bought children and was actually very feared among Native American communities. And when Pocahontas was forced to marry and was abused until she had children, I don't think that it was a marriage she would have had otherwise if it was not against her will. So I can't really say much about that. It's all a lie. I can't even say it's a stereotype because what kind of stereotype is this portraying?
One final note on this film. Throughout the film, Pocahontas is referred to as a princess because she's the chief's daughter, but I've heard that chiefs are actually elected, much like our president. How is the whole princess thing considered offensive if that's the case?
I'm not a super offendable person. I like to teach other people and I like to discuss things that are sensitive because I feel like those are the things we need to be talking about and be more comfortable recognizing each other with. When people say princess, I feel like they're misrepresenting us because it's not that kind of hierarchy. It's not the same, but if they have to dumb it down for somebody or speak it in a different way, that's their own prerogative, but they need to know that it's different. I think it comes back to respect. I'm sorry I keep repeating respect, but if you truly care about understanding other people, you should be willing to learn and listen to everything that everyone has to say.
So, whether or not you've seen the original movie, I would not recommend this one to anyone whatsoever. Our last topic is An American Tale, The Treasure of Manhattan Island. The film takes place between the first and second film, Fiver Goes West. The Mouskowitz have settled into America, and Fiver's father has taken a job at a cheese factory where he and the other workers are being exploited by the higher ups. They even pay the police to keep the workers from striking. But the film really kicks off when Fiverr and his friend Tony discovering a tomb of mice skeletons underneath a subway system, one of them holding what appears to be a treasure map. This leads to the two, along with their friend Tiger and a professor named Dithering and his assistant Scuttlebutt, to go down a passageway to find this treasure. After going through a Indiana Jones style booby trapped passageway, they discover a tribe of Native American mice living underground. Their reason for being there was because their ancestors had fled to the underground passage in order to escape the effects of colonialism. Would you say this is kind of like a native reserve, or is there something different going on here?
I think there's a lot of nuances and different kinds of hate or prejudice due to trauma. I know that still white hate exists within different reservations. And I think that they're right to be fearful because of everything that they've gone through and everything that they've lost and suffered through. I feel like it's become more and more prevalent that it's more of a class issue now. For example, the Irish.
Oh
I'm
yeah,
part
that I'm glad we brought that up because historically the Irish policeman is inaccurate because I don't think until the 1900s they even had Irish policemen. In fact, I
yeah.
happen to be part Irish, and growing up, that and leprechauns were all the representation I was exposed to. And not only is there a scene where the Irish chief of police beats up a worker at the factory for speaking out against his bosses, a scene that I found disturbing on so many levels. And I later learned that Irishmen were pretty much given the same treatment as black people were.
I don't think marginalized and oppressed people should stay separated. I think we should come together. I feel like we shouldn't be fearful because of the different levels of melanin in our skin. I really think that we should be value and ethic based now, since we're educated enough and we're exposed enough to know that races aren't anything to be intimidated by, but to be excited to learn from, because we each have lessons to share about how to care for the earth and each other.
The chief's daughter, Shalina, befriends Fyra and they form a real bond. She even reveals what the so called treasure is, the history of her tribe. Would you say this might be a little much, or is there no issue with being okay to know about your people?
I think there's a lot of sacred knowledge that should be shared. A lot of people protect it so that it's not overused or, overconsumed. Things like sacred things that we use within different cultures of indigenous peoples, like peyote or ayahuasca or things like that. People aren't using things in the way that they should because they don't hold it under the cultural context. And that's not just Native Americans, that's indigenous people all over the world. I think everyone should treasure everyone's cultural history. It depends on how you do it, right? Like everyone who has a dream catcher, what does it mean to you? Why do you have one and where do you have it? Are you using it in the ways that you should be? Or are you hanging it in front of your car mirror? It really depends on how you respect the cultures. I don't think wearing a headdress would ever be appropriate because you've never been in the tribe that wears headdresses. Not all tribal people wear headdresses. Not all chiefs wear headdresses. It's just not true. Not in the way that is represented in American culture. I don't think it's ever appropriate to wear something like that because you haven't earned it. You didn't come from that tribe and you don't respect it if you wear it. So it's just being mindful of what you do and how you respect those cultures is what's important.
I'll never look at that Danny Phantom episode again where they use a ghost catcher, which is modeled off a dream catcher.
It honestly depends. Like, if it came from a native person, maybe they're trying to rebrand our traditions or retell our traditions. As storytellers, which all humans are storytellers, we're able to retell stories that came from our culture. And I think it's really important to continue to share those stories. Just like traditions, right? Some traditions are from our trauma. For example, fry bread was from what we were rationed, flour and water. It's all we could make to eat and survive. So it became a staple in our culture. It's not healthy. People have diabetes and people have health issues, and this being tied into our culture is a very unhealthy thing if you're constantly eating it. So those kinds of traditions can be bad, and it's something that we should break, and we should make more cultural traditions and renew cultural traditions.
Inspired by her words, Pfeiffer offers to show Shalina his world. Chief agrees to this so that Shalina can be able to report back to see if the surface drillers have indeed changed their ways. However, things get complicated when Scuttlebutt, who is really a spy for the cheese factory owners, reports back to them to reveal the existence of Shalina and the tribe. However, since the cheese factory workers were currently striking, the three owners decide to use this to their advantage by shifting the focus away from their working conditions to that of the Native American mice, specifically by taking advantage of their xenophobic beliefs. After going through what Trump did with Mexico, trying to build the wall around because, quote, Mexico's stealing jobs from us. Do you think that such things are relevant more so today in relation to this film?
I say our focuses have just shifted to different races to hate. First, or not first, but it was like natives, Mexican, Latina X people, and then we're talking Irish, Chinese, any people who wanted to live a life of freedom were hated and marginalized if you couldn't afford it. They're just political tools to divide us. And with the wall situation, it's being built through a sacred forest area where there's an endangered species. And it's illegal. It's literally illegal against humanity, against the earth to build this wall. And yet we're going to. And for why? So they can go leave somewhere else? They can go somewhere else? This doesn't make sense. It's just destructive.
Unfortunately, the workers' fears are able to cloud their judgment and they are put into a frenzy. While Five and Tony are able to rescue Shalina, the professor is accused of being a traitor and sentenced to death at the butcher shop. But after he's rescued by Tiger, Papa Mousewitz is able to convince the other mice that they have let their own prejudiced thoughts get in the way of their own judgment. This results in the workers turning against their bosses. In a last-ditch effort, the factory owners send the police accompanied by Scuttlebutt to kill off the Native American mice. Thankfully, Five, along with his sister Tanya, Tony, and Shalina, were able to return to the tribe and warn them about the incoming danger. After driving the enemies off, the chief knew that they would return in greater numbers and supplies the kids with a keg of gunpowder that they can use to block the passage leading into their home. After Fivo says his goodbyes to Shalina, the group set out on their mission, but are intercepted by Scuttlebutt and the chief of police. Thankfully, the bomb is set off, and the passage is flooded, taking the two villains with it. The film ends on a happy note with not only Fivo discovering that there's a secret passage to the tribe underneath the Statue of Liberty via telescope, but it is also revealed that Papa Mousewitz has formed a workers' union, thereby allowing negotiations between them and the cheese factory owners. On top of that, Tiger is made the new chief of police, thereby cutting off their additional resources to keep the workers in line. Now, racism and similarities to Trump aside, I think in some ways the film is more relevant today than it has been in years, especially when you think about the labor strikes that have occurred due to concerns of AI. And the fact that the cheese factory owners are still in power shows the underlying message that the rich will remain rich and that the working class will have slightly better benefits. And this is relevant because in Hollywood, animators are being able to be better paid with more benefits. The negotiations weren't able to do anything about AI, thereby putting their jobs at risk still. But as a whole, I think this film is, well, a bit mature for a direct-to film. I think this is one of those movies that you should sit down with your children so you can add context to the overlining themes of it. And while it's not for everyone, I think it's still something that kids should know at some point in their lives. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Critimation, Alyssa, and I hope you have a great time forging your career path at PNCA.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my experience and my background.
Thanks for tuning in to Critimation. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter, or support me on Patreon. I'm open to suggestions, and I will see you next time.